Hello, my name is Dawn Kennedy and I'm Director of Science at the Hazeley Academy, which is part of the 5 Dimensions Trust. Today I'm going to be talking about my tips for supporting students with metacognition in online learning environment, but equally these tips work in the face-to-face classroom and blended learning approaches as well. My first tip is modelling my own metacognition. Often I do this through worked examples of very tricky questions, and it gives me the opportunity to break down the question and show students how I decipher what the question is asking me to do. It allows me to point out the common pitfalls, the common mistakes that can be made in the question, and also allows me with many questions to show students there is more than one strategy, there is more than one possible way to solve a problem, or in some questions, there is more than one possible answer that they could give. The other thing that I would do in this area is also modelling revision tools and techniques. I find that students often understand what a lot of the revision techniques are, but they don't really understand how to use them themselves. So this could be, for example, taking a mind map and as part of a revision session, taking the list of topics that are coming up in an end of unit test and actually showing the students live how I would turn that list of topics into a revision resource, a mind map that could be used to revise for their exams. My second tip is then getting the students to model their own metacognition with their peers. I find this works best if they will unmute themselves and discuss this, so it's good development for their oracy as well. But because students are often unwilling to unmute themselves in a larger classroom, I find that this often works if I use it with small group tasks and allow the students to discuss between themselves in groups of sort of 4 or 5 students each. When I'm setting the tasks, I intentionally pick questions that have more than one possible solution or strategy to solve them. And that means that there's often a difference of opinion within the group, which stimulates discussion about how the students would each solve the problem. My third technique is then the topic wrapper. Essentially, this is a questioning technique and could be done as sort of a live questioning with me directing, or could be done as a questionnaire or a Microsoft form, for example. I tend to find that this works best actually as a live discussion because you get greater depth of answers and a greater depth of reflection from the students because you can ask follow-up questions based on their responses. But essentially, this is activating what they already know at the beginning of the topic, getting them to think about links with prior work, and then getting them to think about the strategies they've used in those prior topics that link in here, and think about what has been successful before, what hasn't been so successful, and evaluate which strategies they think they need to use as they go through the study of this topic. Then once they reach the end of the topic, it's very important to then get them to evaluate what worked well and what didn't work well again in this topic, and think in advance about should they want to use this strategy again in the future, what would they change or what would they do differently next time to make it more effective. As I say, you can do this as a formal questionnaire, and I have tried to do it both those ways, but I found that I got very brief, not very detailed responses from the students. But when I did it as a class discussion, I got much greater depth of the answers, and then I just got them to fill in the questionnaire part at the end as an online Microsoft form for our records. My fourth technique is developing their self-regulation. Now, some students have really flown with this over the lockdown period and they've really developed in this regard. Others have found it much more challenging. The key things that I use here is using interleaving and retrieval practice regularly to allow the students to assess how their learning is progressing, and guiding students to actually use the results of those interleaving sessions and retrieval practice sessions to reflect on how they are doing and what they need to change and what they need to do in the future. I find that you have to be quite explicit about that. Students will not necessarily do that part by themselves. And then also that allows us to guide students into strategies that might help them improve in the future. Also evaluating if the strategy they are already using isn't working and whether or not they need to make a change. Students can be quite attached to the way that they do things, and sometimes you do need to be, again, quite explicit about guiding them into thinking about if they do need to change something and they need to move a little bit out of their comfort zone and try something new. Also, for a lot of students, time management can be an issue, and for those who do struggle with time management, I will use a mixture of some very structured time frames in terms of work that has to be handed in by the end of the lesson, work that then they have maybe a week to complete, or longer term pieces of homework which might be based over 2 or 3 weeks, to start to develop their time management skills. And depending on the class will depend on the mixture between those different timeframes that I would use with a particular group. My fifth tip is then having choice grids, often for their independent work. I find, as I mentioned earlier, some students get very stuck in a certain pattern or a certain way of working, and they're very unwilling to change. With the choice grids, often we have a block of 9 different options, all leading towards the same outcomes, but giving 9 different ways of approaching that particular piece of work. Now, students will have to pick 2 or 3 from the grid, which means usually the first one they pick is going to be their favorite strategy that they use already, but then they have to try something different. But I think it's important to keep the grids with the 9 or a limited number of options. If you give students a completely infinite choice, it becomes a bit overwhelming for them and they seem to be unable to choose which strategies to pick. Whereas if you give them a selection to pick from, they are much more willing to pick some and pick something new that they haven't tried before. Hopefully that's been helpful. Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.